They outnumbered him nearly 2 to 1. 86,000 men against fewer than 50,000. By the standards of the ancient world, it should not have been close. By the end of that afternoon, one of the largest armies Rome had ever assembled was gone. Not driven back, not scattered into retreat, but closed inside a ring of enemy spears with nowhere left to stand. This is Cannae, and the trap that swallowed a Roman army whole wasn't sprung by superior numbers. It was built out of Rome's own strength, the very formation that was supposed to make them unstoppable. By the time the ring closed, there was no line left to fall back to. No gap, no direction that led anywhere but into more of the enemy. So the real question isn't how Hannibal won. It's this: how does the strongest formation on the field become the reason an army can't survive? For 2 years, Rome had been losing. Not skirmishes, entire armies. At the Trebia, in the winter of 218 BC, a Roman force was drawn across a freezing river and broken. At Lake Trasimene the following spring, an entire consular army marched into fog along a narrow lakeshore road and was annihilated almost to the last man. One of the worst single-day defeats in Roman history to that point. According to the Greek historian Polybius, writing within a generation of the battle, Roman casualties in these campaigns already ran into the tens of thousands. Rome's answer was to go bigger. In the summer of 216 BC, the Senate raised what ancient sources describe as the largest army Rome had ever put into the field: 8 legions and their allied contingents, somewhere in the range of 70 to 86,000 men, depending on which ancient account you follow. Modern historians treat the higher figures with some caution, but even the conservative estimates describe a force far larger than anything Hannibal could put opposite it. The logic was simple, and on paper, it made sense. More men meant more weight. Mass wins battles. 2 commanders, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, alternated command by the day. A Roman custom, not a flaw by itself, but one that historians still debate for how it may have shaped what happened next. The assumption baked into Rome's plan was this: pack the infantry deeper than usual, narrow the front, and drive straight through the center of Hannibal's line by sheer accumulated force. If the line is thick enough, it cannot break. What Rome didn't account for was what a deep, narrow formation gives up in exchange for that weight. Space. Room to maneuver. Room to see what's happening on the flanks. An army built entirely to push forward has almost no way to react sideways. Hannibal, watching from across the field near the small town of Cannae in southern Italy, understood something the Roman command did not yet grasp. An army that thinks its size is its strength has already told you exactly how it intends to fight. Straight ahead, all at once, with everything committed to the center. That single assumption is what the entire battle was about to be built around. Hannibal's army was a patchwork by comparison. Gallic and Iberian infantry, Numidian and Gallic-Iberian cavalry, and a corps of seasoned African infantry that had marched with him since the Alps. He placed his center forward of his flanks, bulging outward toward the Roman line, a shape historians call a convex formation. It was made up largely of his least battle-hardened troops, Gauls and Iberians, fighting alongside each other, not behind a wall of veterans. Here's the detail worth sitting with. Hannibal built his weakest line to face the heaviest part of the Roman attack. Why would a commander deliberately put his softest troops directly in the path of Rome's main push? Every ordinary instinct says you protect your center. Hannibal did the opposite. and said nothing about why, at least not in any surviving record. Behind and to the sides, his veteran African infantry waited, still and unengaged, positioned along the flanks rather than the front. His cavalry, Numidian light horse on one wing, heavier Gallic and Iberian cavalry on the other, took position on the extreme edges of the field, facing a Roman cavalry force that was, by most ancient accounts, both outnumbered and outclassed in quality. Nothing about the setup announced itself as a trap. To a Roman officer looking across the field that morning, it likely looked like an army arranged for a straightforward collision. Center against center, flank against flank. That was the point. The open loop Hannibal built into his own line, a center position to give ground, wouldn't make sense until the Roman infantry was already inside it. The battle opened as Rome expected it to. The heavy Roman infantry pressed forward against Hannibal's center, and the center did what centers under pressure often do. It gave ground. But it gave ground slowly, deliberately, not a collapse, a controlled withdrawal, bending backward under the weight of the Roman push rather than breaking apart. For the Roman soldiers advancing, this looked like exactly what they'd trained for working. The center was failing. Push harder, and it breaks completely. So they pushed harder. Legion after legion funneled into the widening gap, packing tighter and tighter as the space narrowed. The same deep formation that was supposed to be Rome's advantage, now working against it, compressing thousands of men into a shrinking wedge with less and less room to fight, or to see, or to turn. While the center bent, the flanks decided the battle. On the Roman left, Hannibal's Numidian light cavalry pinned down and outmaneuvered the Roman horse, screening that flank from any chance of reinforcement. On the Roman right, the heavier Gallic and Iberian cavalry under Hasdrubal, a Carthaginian commander, not to be confused with Hannibal's more famous brother of the same name, broke through the outnumbered Roman cavalry in a shorter, harder fight, then did something decisive. Instead of chasing the fleeing Romans off the field, they wheeled around behind the entire battle. That decision, discipline over pursuit, is, according to modern historians like Adrian Goldsworthy, one of the more remarkable tactical choices of the entire engagement. Cavalry that has just won a fight almost never turns down an easy chase. This cavalry did. They swept behind the Roman rear and struck the Numidians' opposite flank from behind, finishing that fight, and then rode on toward the one place that mattered most, the back of the Roman infantry, which by now was fully committed, packed shoulder to shoulder, and facing entirely the wrong direction to see them coming. This was the moment the convex center had been built for. As the Carthaginian cavalry closed in from behind, Hannibal's African veteran infantry, untouched until now, positioned along the flanks precisely for this, turned inward and struck the sides of the Roman formation. Front. Both flanks. Rear. The line that looked like it was breaking had been giving ground on purpose, drawing the Roman mass deeper into a space, with a closing door on every side. There was no gap left to retreat through, no flank left uncontested. The same density that Rome had built for offensive weight now made it almost impossible for the men inside to raise a weapon, let alone maneuver. What followed was not a battle in any tactical sense anymore. It was containment. By later ancient accounts, Polybius among the earliest, Livy writing a generation after him, Roman losses that single day ran into the tens of thousands, a scale of single-day slaughter that ancient and modern historians alike still treat as almost without parallel in the period. The precise figure is disputed, the scale is not. By evening, the field outside Cannae held one of the largest single-day losses of life in ancient military history. Estimates from ancient sources range as high as 50 to 70,000 Roman and Allied dead. Modern historians generally treat the lower end of that range as more plausible, while agreeing the total was catastrophic by any measure. Both consuls were affected. Paulus was killed in the fighting. Varro survived and eventually made his way back to Rome, where, notably, he was not put on trial or removed from public life, a detail some historians read as recognition that the disaster was structural, not simply one man's failure. News reached Rome as panic. According to Livy, the city braced for Hannibal to march on it directly. He didn't. Whether that was caution, a lack of siege equipment, a deliberate strategy of exhaustion rather than annihilation, or something else entirely, remains one of the most argued questions in ancient military history, and no surviving source gives a fully satisfying answer. Cannae outlived the war it was fought in. Long after Carthage was gone, the double envelopment Hannibal executed that day became one of the most studied tactical maneuvers in military history, a shape commanders would try to recreate, deliberately or not, for more than 2,000 years afterward. And there's a real irony sitting at the center of it. Cannae was, tactically, close to a perfect victory. And it didn't win Hannibal the war. Rome refused to surrender, rebuilt its armies, changed its strategy entirely, and 16 years later, ended Carthage as a power for good. Which leaves the counterfactual historian still arguing over what happens if Hannibal marches on Rome right after Cannae, while the city is at its most exposed. There's no consensus. It remains one of the most debated what-ifs in military history. A question this channel isn't going to pretend to settle either. What Cannae does answer, clearly, is the question this video opened with. The Roman formation wasn't beaten because it was weak. It was beaten because its own strength, density, mass, a deep unbroken line, became the exact thing that sealed it in. The trap wasn't something bolted on from outside. It was built from the shape of the army walking into it. If a battle like this deserves a deeper look, the next one waiting in the wings tells a strikingly similar story. A disciplined army, certain of its own strength, walking into a trap it never saw coming.